gone 12 o'clock, so I think we should kick off. So I'd love to just firstly introduce myself. So my name is John Farger, one of the co-founders here at AgriWebb, and we will be hosting this session today. And before I go in and introduce our learned panel of colleagues, I will just give a quick introduction on myself. So I'm actually a fifth generation pastoralist from northern South Australia in the Flinders Ranges. I've always been really passionate about farming, particularly livestock, bringing innovation and also technology to the industry. And I guess I'm really excited for today's session. Something that's been close to my heart is regenerative agriculture and some practices that we've followed as a family business for many generations, really around kind of best practice land management, handling erosion, handling feral animals, and really just sort of setting the business up for future generations and being good custodians of the land, which is really the heart of what we're going to be talking to you today about. So look, the focus is on regenerative agriculture. Look, it's really pertinent to a lot of the macro issues we're facing as an industry globally, really. I mean, we're looking to kind of meet the growing population. We've got to do more from less. We've got to farm more sustainably. We've got to meet rising consumer demands and of course, the carbon footprint that we've got to deal with. So look, it's clearly a topical conversation. We have had almost 1,500 people register for this event, and I can see we already have hundreds that have already signed in today. So it's going to be an absolutely cracker of a session. Really, really excited, and hopefully all of you guys find it really, really valuable, educational and thought-provoking throughout the session. So before I hand it over some introductions from our panelists, I might just do some housekeeping, talk through what today's going to be about. So ultimately, we're going to be with you for an hour and a half. We really encourage you to use the Q&A section within Zoom. So if you go in there, if you could fire in your questions, you can also actually vote for those questions that you want to see answered through Zoom. So please go in and do that. And what we'll try and do is towards the end of the session, the last 10 or 15 minutes or so, we will answer those questions for you. We will also be quite interactive throughout the session. There's a lot of questions that have come through from people through the registration process, which has been really amazing. So we're going to address them throughout. And I guess we'll also be recording this session for everyone that wants to go back and have a look, or for those that didn't manage to join but did register, we will be sending out the recording for everyone along with a survey, because ultimately, we want to do a better job delivering content to the farming community, bringing the community together through education and awareness on a range of topics. And obviously today is about regenerative agriculture. And finally, for those Twitter people out there, you can get our handle at AgriWebb, which is AgriWebb. And if you want to use the hashtag Future of Farming, we should see some great items flicking through Twitter. So with no further ado, I'd love to introduce you to our panelists. We have a great lineup for you today. Firstly, initially, Fiona Simpson, the president of NFF, was going to join us. She had some other commitments that she can no longer join, but we are really lucky to have Tony Maha, the chief executive of the NFF, with us today, along with Lorraine Gordon, Sam Trethaway, and Charlie Arnot. And so maybe we will go through and do some introductions. So firstly, I'm going to hand it over to Tony. Tony, if you could give a bit of your background and also, in a sentence or so, explain what regenerative agriculture means to you.
Yeah, g'day everyone. Thanks, John. Apologies that Fiona can't make it today, but I hope I can fill her big shoes. Look, NFF is the peak body trying to represent farmers and agriculture across the country in terms of advocacy on key policies and programs that are going to help drive the industry towards $100 billion. And hopefully some of you have seen our roadmap for $100 billion sector by 2030. So I've been at the NFF actually almost to the day, 8 years now. So I've been in and around agriculture for most of my working life, worked across supply chains, food supply chains in government, and now with the NFF. So I've been CEO for 4 years. Love the job, challenging job, but real passion for agriculture is what drives me. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And look, such a broad role you've got across the industry. So you're going to have some great insights for us today. So thank you for joining. And Lorraine Gordon, wears obviously many hats across the industry. If you could give us your background and what Regen Ag means to you would be great.
So to unmute myself. Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Lorraine Gordon. First and foremost, I am a beef cattle trader from Ebor in northern New South Wales. So I do get my hands very dirty every week. I'm Director of Strategic Projects at Southern Cross University, Farming Together, which many of you would have heard of, and founder of the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance. I'm also Associate Director of the Organics Research Centre at Southern Cross Uni. So what does Regen Ag mean to me? Look, I look at it, I have a very simple meaning for it. It's leaving the landscape and the environment in a healthier, more improved state than we found it. But my son, Ethan, came up with a fantastic definition of regenerative ag. And really everyone is going to have a different definition, I believe, because it's everybody's individual journey. But he has referred to regenerative ag as it's a part of a self-organising quality inherent in nature, which many practices consciously or unconsciously encourage. This is a quality where every living system has inherent within it the possibility to move to new levels of order, differentiation and organisation. While sustainable systems must maintain productivity, regenerative systems go a step further in restoring what has been lost and improving what is currently there. Regenerative agriculture has emerged as an umbrella term for any agricultural activity that restores and enhances holistic, resilient systems. It can include many old and new practices. An agriculture practice is not regenerative when it is discouraging the evolutionary and self-organising potential of a living system. So there you go, there's an academic's take on it.
There you go. Thank you for that, Lorraine. I'd love to dig into more of the academic slant and some of the research and results that comes out of that later today. So thank you. Sam Trethaway, obviously excited to have you on. Sam and I go way back in the ag tech scene in Melbourne. Always excited to hear your views. Now back on farm in Tasmania. Sam, a bit of background and what it means to you would be great.
Thanks, John, and yeah, thanks, mate. It's awesome to be here. So we're based in Tassie. We've got a fast-growing Wagyu business. We're doing grass-fed Wagyu, farmed regeneratively. We're becoming a vertically integrated brand, I raised money for this about 12 months ago. And yeah, it's all happening. And we'll have over 1,000 acres under management in the next month or two. So running around 2,000 heads. So it's all go. Regenerative agriculture is an interesting one because it is like Lorraine had mentioned, it's a broad set of ideals and principles, which I think presents many issues from an integrity point of view with consumers. They're going to get very confused as to what it actually means. But it also means that there's a lot of flexibility and opportunity. So just 3 quick things from me on this. So for me, the biggest piece is it's a fundamental shift in our mindset. So the way we look at our farms, soils, natural processes, and animals. The biggest thing for me is it's about not killing stuff. So we're coming out of a small period of around 70 or so years where we've tried to control, dominate, and in some way fight natural systems through chemicals, narrow spectrum fertilizers, and a pretty non-diverse plant base. And I suppose to that point, then it's about therefore working with natural processes. There's nothing natural about what I had just mentioned. And so it's about mimicking nature and putting carbon at the center of that system. So they're the kind of 3 pieces for me, which kind of encapsulate, grazing systems, plant species, inputs and all of that kind of, is Regen Ag to me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. And plenty to dig into, particularly I think the carbon piece will pop up today to provide some active conversation. So thank you for that. And finally, our final panelist, Charlie Arnot, obviously a regenerative farmer and an educator, also with a very strong Instagram following. Mate, if you could share your background and what Regen Ag means to you, would be great.
Thanks, John. Just firstly, I'm pretty stoked to see so many people on the call and sort of letting us know where they are. That's fantastic. I've noticed there's no one from Burrawa yet, so I have to have a yarn with them when I get home. So I'm an 8th generation farmer. We actually farmed in Scotland before we came out here, so I don't know quite how far it goes back, but far enough. And we farmed very, I guess, conventionally for many years. And 15 years ago, mixed farming at Burrawa. 15 years ago, we changed our mind about a lot of things, and which we'll probably get to. But nonetheless, we've been doing things very differently. So in terms of under sort of an umbrella of regenerative agriculture, in terms of a definition, mine is reasonably loose because it's one of those things that I think everyone has their own, and it's important that they do, and it's reflective of the non-prescriptive nature of regenerative agriculture. So I really reference the 5 landscape functions of solar and mineral and biological and hydrological, those 4, and then the 5th landscape function is that of the people and the community and the social and cultural fabric of that landscape. That sort of, yes, it's broad, and it's the one that Charlie Massey talks about in Call of the Reed Warbler. The other one, which I like, which is even more simple, is just essentially, and the core of it is increasing the quality and quantity of soil, because if we can do that, pretty much all those landscape functions improve. So that's really, that's my take on it. As I said, it's non-prescriptive, and I'd just like to thank you guys, AgriWebb, for putting this on. It's a wonderful thing. There's some interesting comments in your, I can't remember where I saw it, in Facebook or somewhere, and I trust that the listeners and the viewers take this opportunity to listen and understand and learn and ask questions about regenerative agriculture, and be open to what we're talking about. Everyone's got their sort of current paradigms about how they do things, and that's great, because we've got to sort of have some sort of, I guess, guideline or principles that and values that we stand behind. What you'll probably hear about today may be sit beside it. It may be actually counter to what you're thinking, and that's fine too. I guess ask that everyone, that's why they're here, to listen and learn, and to be open to what we're going to talk about. Hang on, there's a couple of people near Burrawa. Lovely.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Charlie. And yeah, absolutely. It's so exciting to see people throwing out the comments of where they're coming from. We have well over 400 people now online, and that number is trending up. So really great to see, and I think a testament of the topic of people being so interested in what we're going to talk about. And Charlie, I think you made a great point there around the different views of people on what regenerative agriculture means, and that's a great place to start, actually. And maybe I might hand this over to Tony, and then maybe Sam can give some views as well. Is look, how do you think regenerative agriculture is actually viewed in the industry? Following on from what Charlie was just saying there. Sorry, Tony, you just have to unmute. Yep.
How many times has that been said in the last 3 months? Sorry, John. Yeah, and actually in my intro, I didn't give my view, so I kind of took a bit of an easy way out, heard everyone else's definition of what Regen Ag is, but I kind of subscribe to the general idea around it being a philosophy, an approach, a strategy, and ideas, and I think I align with most people in terms of, and perhaps Charlie particularly, and I think it'll get to your point, John, around what the view is in industry, that it really does vary from, region to region or farmer to farmer around those views, that regime, those ideas that can apply to their particular business. And essentially it's about looking after the water, the soil, the ecosystems, the biodiversity on farm. So that's our approach. And, it's some ways perhaps around definition of what we call sustainability and how long that lasts. And so there's a few sort of variables in there, but ultimately it's about enhancing, and I think Lorraine said that, enhancing the natural ecosystem. So how's it viewed in industry? Well, I think there's varying views. And again, without sounding like a lawyer, it depends on where you are and what sort of business that you've got. But there is, I think, no doubt, and I think, we can flesh this out a little bit today. There's varying levels of certainty and definition around what it means. There's probably a little bit of skepticism around there, around, you know, what is defined when we say regenerative agriculture, and how does that different from, you know, existing or good practices, sustainable practices, and again, what does that mean? So, but I think the general idea and concept of people maintaining, improving, retaining the ecosystem and the biodiversity on farm is very well understood, but the adoption and the subscription to regenerative agriculture, I think there's probably varied views in the industry that I see, at least anyway.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reflective there, Tony. And I think, you know, already on this panel, we've got some great sort of definitions and what it means to the folk that are on the panel. And you know, we're going to hear from more throughout the day. Sam, what's your take on how you see the sort of the ag industry and how it's viewed, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, like Tony said, it's really difficult, and of course, I'm going to generalise. I suppose, and our industry is made up of lots of different silos. So if we look at farmers, you know, knowing farmers as well as I do, I think it's, you know, more broadly from a conventional mindset, which the majority of agricultural produce in Australia is produced within, is essentially it's going to be met with a lot of scepticism and cynicism, as most farmers do on most things. It's kind of in our blood, I think. You know, there's always a new ute or a snake oil salesman or someone driving down the driveway, and you know, at the end of the day, are we growing stuff substantially different to what we were 30, 40 years ago? Yet all these kind of fads and things have come through. So I think that's going to be the go-to position. And of course, it'll just be after a while where we start to see those innovators and early adopters pick up, you know, certain practices, and then there's the kind of looking over the boundary fence when we start to see those improvements take place, as we start to see some mass adoption. That's from a farmer perspective. If you think of our retail supply chain, so, you know, our big retailers that provide us with inputs for farms, how do they view it? I mean, I would imagine once you get into the depths of regen ag, I should think that they may be a little bit concerned how they're going to meet that demand. Being a farmer myself, that takes up, you know, all of my working week, I don't have a lot of support in the way I want to farm from suppliers. They're not equipped from a knowledge point of view or from a product point of view to support my business. So it is actually quite a lonely road, and you need to be, you know, you spend a lot of time just procurement and sourcing stuff that doesn't fit the kind of, you know, cookie cutter model. And then just lastly, you know, kind of jumping outside the industry, if I may, just for 30 seconds, from a food industry perspective, what we're finding is it's incredibly exciting. Consumers are seeing that there's an opportunity to produce a cleaner, better quality food product that requires less chemical inputs and all these other great things. And again, that's very broad as to how we do that. And that's kind of come across quite clearly as, you know, so far throughout just now, but there's an enormous amount of excitement post farm gate as to what this means and what it could be, and, you know, the future of farming.
Yeah, well, Sam, actually, I'm glad you picked up on the topic of the consumer, because that's one area that you know, we'd love to flesh out throughout this session today. But just going back to one point you mentioned there around the improvements, and we've heard from people today already, that the panel today already about handing the land back or transferring it in a better position than when we took it on, being good custodians of the land. You know, what are the benefits? You know, let's talk about actually the benefits of regenerative agriculture, and maybe Charlie, I can hand it over to you to give kind of some insights on what the benefits are, and then maybe Lorraine, you could also come in and give your thoughts on you know, what those sort of overarching benefits are.
Thanks, John. I guess I like using it's an RCS model of a three-legged pot. So we're looking at the three legs of a pot, basically the economics or the financial situation of the business, the production system that is supported by the financial system, and the environment or the resources that are used, and they're all intertwined and they all have their role to play. And so from, I guess, an ecological point of view, landscape, and I'm referencing me and being reasonably generic, we don't use any chemicals at Hannah Minnow. So we're not introducing, you know, foreign materials, as it were, man-made materials into an environment which we believe has all the resources in it already used in a particular way or in various ways to create what we want and to help drive, the production system and drive the economics of the business. So that's just I guess one example. I mean, so there's less inputs in terms of foreign sort of materials and so on. And there's also the outcomes of just working more closely with nature and letting nature, which has, as I said, every tool and every opportunity it needs to have, exist in nature itself. So what we're finding is we're getting more bird species, we're getting greater diversity in our pastures. We're creating opportunities for nature to do its thing, essentially. Our water penetration is better because we're retaining ground cover because we want that pasture diversity. So relating it back to, without doing every one, those 5 landscape functions, all that cycling, then from an ecological point of view, they're all being enhanced. And every farmer has a different way of doing it and a different technique. But at the end of the day, that's happening. Financially, as a very basic one, our cost structure is very low. We don't drench, we don't vaccinate, we don't handle our animals unnecessarily. So our direct costs are very low, as an example. And as a consequence, our cash flow is better. And we also, given that we graze holistically or manage grazing, our inventory turnover is not high, but it's, there's a good flow, so there's good cash flow as well. So those three pots, those 3 legs, they hold up the pot, and in the pot are people, right? And this is the bit that people don't often sort of consider. Is another benefit of regenerative ag in its broad sense is well-being. And so we were involved in a survey that was done last year, a year before, by Vanguard, Mark Gardner and a number of other people at ANU, with help from federal government funding. And a number of outcomes from that survey were coming. And one of them was well-being, and I think the numbers were something like regenerative farmers in this small group that was surveyed were 30% higher in terms of their well-being. And I think that's something that, that doesn't appear on a balance sheet. That's something that we don't talk about in the pub. That's something that ABARE doesn't sort of tick off on their list of things. And that's probably one of the most important, because if you've got people with sound thinking and sound mind and they're actually happy and purposeful, then a lot of the other 3 legs of the pot, then it's a much they function much better. The one leg I did forget was the production system. So we're cattle, we're sheep, we're pigs. The integration of those livestock enterprises is easier again, and what we're finding is actually healthier. Animals are healthier if you take out some of the inputs that we were used to do. They actually, again, nature and animals are pretty much self-organising creatures, and if we can let them build up immunity to things, let them eat diversely in the pasture and medicate themselves, very simply, those things make a big difference.
Well, I'm glad you actually mentioned the health side there, Charlie. It's actually a question from the audience. Judy have said, is there research or evidence of the regenerative benefits to livestock and animal health, nutrition and performance? So Lorraine, perhaps you could touch on that in addressing that.
Sure. Do you want me to address all the research stuff now, or will I stick on the benefits of regen ag?
Yeah, why don't you start with the benefits, but also touch on the research side? I think would be really, really useful for
Sure, no worries. So look, yeah, and I concur with what Charlie is saying. The benefits of regen ag are actually, you need to look at them from a triple bottom line perspective. And often, and that means you need to look at the economics, the environmental aspects and the social aspects, which Charlie's alluded to. And often we hear there is a little bit of argy-bargy and argument going on around the economics. What can I say? They're asking the wrong question. They're asking the wrong question, because you cannot look at those things in isolation. And if drought, fires and COVID hasn't taught us that, well, then we're a pretty stupid race, quite frankly. So, I mean, it is really important that when we talk about regenerative ag, we talk about it in a holistic manner and we look at those 3 elements. So economically, you're going to see that there's less up and downs. So regenerative farms don't have the big swings and roundabouts that some of the conventional farms have. It's a pretty solid result. More consistent returns, no boom and bust scenarios, less expensive artificial inputs such as inorganic fertilizers and pesticides, less overheads and variable expenses, resulting in financial sustainability for future generations. Environmentally, you're going to see increased biodiversity of pastures, insects, bird species, and basically a real resilience within the landscape. Better soil profiles and composition, and that is a response basically from increasing soil organic carbon. But socially, and this is a very important element, and there is some quite solid research that has been done. It actually forms part of my own research through the University of New England, because I'm actually looking at triple bottom line outcomes of regenerative practices in comparison to conventional practices. And socially, families are proving to be more resilient. We're getting less mental and physical health problems in regenerative family farms. Massive increases in well-being and overall resilience, and more connected to landscape, people, and the communities in which where they reside. So, you know, there is a lot of research being done now in this, but you've got to understand that the practice and this movement is going at such a fast pace, and research takes time. So even with my own research, it's a longitudinal study. I ended up interviewing through case studies a number of family farms back in 2016. That was pre the concept of regenerative agriculture, pre-drought, pre-climate change really biting in, and certainly pre-COVID-19. And now I'm actually re-interviewing those families to see how they've stacked up. And this is comparing neighbour to neighbour. So a regenerative practice to a conventional system. And it's some very interesting results are coming out from that. John, do you want me to talk about some of the other research that's being done on that, or will I leave that till a little bit later?
Yeah, I think let's cover that later. But great to see some of the results that are going to come out of that further work you do. Really, really interesting. And I think the flip side to this is, you know, I guess we've touched on some of the benefits here, and maybe we should look at the flip side in you know, what are the barriers to adopting regenerative agriculture? You know, things such as location, cost, you know, weather conditions, soil conditions, if there's people at containment feeding, and maybe Tony, if you could you know, give your perspective from a broader industry perspective, seeing it at a very macro level across many sectors and industries, on your views on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. So I think fundamentally, you know, a barrier, if we're asking about what barriers might be there, it's your opening question. I mean, what is regenerative agriculture, and how do people understand that? What's their perception? What's their definition of it, and what does it mean to their business? So, what if they're undertaking a business right now? What is the gap between what they're doing and what regenerative agriculture might mean? So, and what are the steps to get there? And importantly, I think, and this, for me at least, goes to the central discussion point around this, is how do we measure regenerative agriculture? How do we know when we're there? Is there an end point? I imagine it's a journey for most people. You know, you never actually get there. It's continuing to refine and update and improve. Is there an end point? So I feel like, you know, those are some of the barriers to people if they're looking at and watching the discussion, of which there's a lot of what is regenerative agriculture and how different is it to what I'm already doing or have done for the last few decades. So that's kind of a fundamental philosophical type of question, but I do feel like that's a barrier. From a practical point of view, I think that, and I'm interested in teasing out perhaps what Sam mentioned around, you know, supply chain barriers. So what are the practical barriers that might stop a person or a business from actually doing it. So what does that mean on farm? I mean, I suppose it means technical capacity and hardware. You know, when we're talking about sensors, we're talking about connectivity to actually measure soil moisture and you know, water runoff and all of these sorts of things. So the technical capacity for people to put systems in place on their farm that they can then measure any differences or benefits. So a practical sense, John, the technical hardware stuff, capability on farm, and then that broader higher level understanding of what is it that I'm not doing that I should be doing if I want to go down the regenerative agriculture pathway.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And Sam, maybe you can pick up on Tony's point there, potentially starting of you know, what you've actually done on your place. You know, what are some of the practices that you've actually done? You know, give the audience some examples around that to paint a bit of a picture. And I know that you've also been doing some work on the carbon side as well. So. Yeah,
sure. So yeah, big question, and I'll try and keep it nice and concise for everyone because we're running a little bit behind, I think. But so the barriers for me, honestly, it's actually truly, and it sounds a bit fluffy, but it's actually a mindset thing. So the way we look at our farms, the way you look at weeds, the way you look at pastures and soils is very, very different to what I've experienced after 15 years in more of a conventional kind of focused system. So that is what I would say is the biggest barrier, because once you get through that and you start to look at things in a different way, it all starts to click together and whatnot. The next piece, and Tony brought it up after my original point, was that supply chain kind of support piece. So, you know, getting the tools, inputs and other things that you need to drive these on-farm processes. And it's great, you know, Charlie's doing a lot of it himself on farm and we're working towards that. But as far as priming the pump, it's just difficult to do that. But I mean, as far as other barriers go, to answer your direct or an original question, I don't really see any from a low marginal rainfall areas. You know, rotational grazing, RCS type principles have been proven time and time again to increase the carrying capacity and health of the land. So yeah, just to jump on to the next piece. So the biggest issue, and Tony had mentioned this, is data. So one thing, and given my ag tech background, is we're building data around everything that we're doing. So I want to see regenerative agriculture become the predominant way we produce food around the world. And the only way we're going to do that is by attracting large amounts of capital. And the way we're going to do that is by building data around proving kilos of beef produced per hectare versus costs and environmental impact is better or the same or whatever it may be. So we're building data around everything. I'm happy to give access to anyone that data that we're doing. It's ranging from the the three-legged pot that Charlie talked about, where we've got environmental data, on-farm objective measurements that we're doing, where we've got, like, you know, business financial stuff that we're benchmarking and working on. And then, of course, we're doing some really cool stuff with tracking production and you know, kilos of beef produced per hectare and stuff like that. So that's a really big thing. And then that data story, I'm hoping, will encourage other farms to say, oh, you know, here's the proof in the pudding, right? And away they go. So I think, yeah, I don't know if is that kind of,
yeah. Look,
you want to touch on carbon or?
No, I think that's right, Sam. And actually, we've touched on some of the technology side of things. You and Tony have touched on that. We may as well dive in and have a bit of a discussion around that. I guess what do you see is you know, really how does technology play a role in this? You know, we've talked about you know, measuring it, you know, collecting some information and some data on this to kind of prove out what we're trying to achieve. Obviously, here at AgriWebb, you know, we are a software company that delivers farm management software, collecting a lot of information at the ground level. So, what's your views on that piece?
Well, I suppose technology magnifies management. You know, as you would have come across in many hundreds of your clients and subscribers. So you've generally got to be running a fairly good operation to really see the benefits, I would argue, and the efficiency gains of technology. If you're not a particularly good manager and you're bottom 15%er, you know, technology is really just going to be a costly kind of waste of time and pretty difficult for you, I would argue. And again, I'm generalizing, so it's hard to quantify. So I think technology will play a big part in the regenerative space. Originally, I think more around my point around measuring and quantifying exactly what it is that we're doing here and the progress of what we're seeing. You know, having come from the ag tech sector, I probably would stand here in front of you all and say that I don't think that ag tech was quite the silver bullet that I thought that it may have been, because I think there's so many other multi-dimensional things that we need to get right before we see the benefits of technology coming in. But again, just lastly, my point would be is that, you know, no matter what system you choose to run on your farm enterprise, there is a technology stack to sit behind you and help you build on that, no matter what direction you want to go. And AgriWebb and other farm management software will work, you know, for you know, better or worse for different people, but generally you'll find people that are following a specific path and they'll find value in your product.
Yeah, and maybe if we dig into that a bit further, and Charlie, I'd love to get your views on this. You know, if we look at some of the practices, on the ground practices, maybe you could give some examples of actually on the ground regenerative practices. And while answering that, you know, potentially talk around the importance of sort of optimizing stocking rates and pasture rotations. And finally, you know, how technology can help with that. How can technology help with producers in those practices, but measuring it and getting some performance out the other side?
Thanks, John. I guess, I hope I understood your question properly, but I guess one of the great things about regenerative agriculture is its ability to restore landscape functions, and one of the best tools we have is livestock. And we used to, before we changed what we did, we used to set stock a lot of our paddocks. We had mobs everywhere, and we were thinking we're doing a reasonable job, but we would run out of feed, we'd have to buy hay, we would have to adjust cattle, or we would sell in a panic sort of a situation when everyone else was. What we've done over, well, pretty much immediately 15 or so years ago was we understood the importance of loving our grass more than our cattle, changing that mindset. And because we loved our cattle, thinking we were doing them a favour by hanging on to them, and we were actually flogging our grass, which is basically what we're trying to grow. We're grass farmers. Yes, I produce beef and so on, but at the end of the day, I'm a grass farmer, one of my jobs. And so what I did at that point was put our mobs together. Instead of having different age groups of sheep and cattle and so on, we put them into pretty much just, you know, big mobs. And one of the principles behind that is that if you use sheep and cattle and even pigs as a tool to stimulate the growth of grass above ground and sugar sequestration underground, you can have a big impact on soil health. You also have a big impact on the amount of feed that's grown, and you also have a big impact on, especially if you remove chemical use in that system, on the health of the animals. So we did this, and we had some great results. Essentially what you're doing is putting large mobs of animals together in a small area for a short period of time, and then moving them on. Now we're doing moves of sort of every day or 2 or 3, depending on the size of the paddocks and the size of the mob and so on, and also the quality of feed. In doing that, what we're doing is we're allowing recovery of grass that's not being grazed. So we may have paddocks. We have paddocks at Hannah Minnow that, you know, in a growing season, like middle of spring, might get grazed every 30 days. In winter and so on, we may have, and through that part of the year, we may have paddocks that are not touched for 5 or 6 months. And so in doing that, we're letting the grass express its grassness, as Joel Sullivan would say. We're allowing its natural functions and basically its job in the landscape to basically express itself. So it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere. It's growing itself as above ground. It's growing its roots, and it's putting about 30% of the carbon it takes out of the atmosphere into sugars in the ground to feed the biology. So we consider cattle as a tool. Yes, they're a product we sell, but their primary job is to sequester carbon. That's, I guess, a result of what we do, is to grow better grass, because we're creating better soil. In terms of the tech there, John, being able to monitor, record what you're doing, how many animals in the paddock, how much grass, we grass budget. So one thing we didn't do 15 years ago and before was understand how much grass we actually had. It's a standing haystack, essentially. I knew how many bales were in the shed, but now all of my fodder is in the paddock, and I don't have, I do buy a bit of hay just when cattle come and go and sheep, this is a transition of the yards for quarantine. But we haven't supplementary or substitutionally fed for 15 or 16 years. So my point is that by having by knowing how much, I mean, we, in our budget, in our financial budget, we know how much cash is in the bank. We know what the value of our stock is. What we don't generally do as farmers is understand the value and the volume of feed that we have in front of us to feed our stock. And that's pretty important. So we understand how much we have, we document that. Through that, we calculate what paddocks we allocate to what mob, and we graze them accordingly. And we also go back, look over our shoulder to see whether we estimated that right, and you can calibrate your assessments that way. So being able to record the budget going forward, the grass budget going forward, being able to assess that going backwards to see how well you did it, and understanding the productivity of those paddocks based on the number of mouths in that paddock and how long they're able to graze that grass. And then, you know, there's obviously quality assessments as well. So, you know, technology we've found, and we use a number of different types of it, has been invaluable. And I agree with what Sam's comments there before. You know, if you've got a good system, technology is a very good thing. If you don't have a good system, it just complicates things. So it's one of those powerful tools we have, is our ability to grasp budget and to assess assess our pastures and understand, you know, just how much grass we had, and then we can monitor the improvements. We've got years and years of data. If I could find some very smart intern to come along and help us put all that together into some coherent record of that, to actually identify what's happening. My sense is we're doing, I know from the very small bits that we look at and the trends that we're seeing, there's definitely increased amount of grass we're growing and longer periods of the year based on rainfall we get. But now technology, I'm not a big fan of technology, I have to say, but there are definitely, there's the need for technology in ag. Now it's available. So,
yeah, well, that's just it, Charlie. I mean, the thing is of getting an analyst to come in and look at all that information. The beauty of software is that it can do all that for us. And I think that's where we're going to see an exciting future, to be able to look at the trends, make decisions, and move the needle forward. And I also, I also hear that a lot, Charlie, around, we're not beef growers or sheep growers or wool growers, we're grass growers. And ultimately there's a bit of a focus that can get lost on focusing on the wrong areas. And obviously today's discussion is really focusing about grass, about soils, about ecology. Lorraine, do you see, I guess from your perspective, how, looking at some of the research, looking at some of these surveys, the involvement that technology can have in that aspect?
Look, yeah, absolutely. But we've got to just keep everything in perspective. Technology is just a tool. So it's not the answer to every problem. And it's critical to understand the ecology, and having that holistic approach and understanding of complex adaptive systems is the first part of the puzzle. So once you've got that under control, then you can start to add the technology tools that you need to be able to help you to have further understanding of those elements. So look, I honestly think things like drones, when it comes to spot spraying of crops and noxious weeds, fantastic. Cattle collars, oh my God, they are such a great technology tool for time-controlled graziers, that we don't have to be having so much infrastructure in permanent fencing. GPS mapping is critical if we're going to really be able to bring the cost of baselining our carbon measurements down. So, I mean, there's some fantastic work being done even out of UNE in that space, so that we can actually see where our soils on our farms actually change and where we actually need to put a probe and measure for carbon sequestration. And as Charlie's mentioned, the computerized grazing charts and management systems have made life so much easier than having to do that sort of work by hand for holistic graziers and time control graziers. And yeah, there's a ton of apps now coming out. So I think it's just important to keep technology in perspective, that it is a tool, and without a deep understanding of ecology and complex adaptive systems, it's a useless tool if you don't have that at hand first up.
Definitely a holistic approach. And if we sort of look at, okay, well, let's get down to the dollars and cents of all of this. And actually, we've had a question come in from the audience from Jennifer asking, what are the key profit drivers with regenerative farming versus conventional livestock production. And goes on to say, with declining family farming profitability and high costs of productive farmland, how can regenerative farming assist the bottom line and enhance profitability? So Lorraine, I don't know whether you want to comment on that off the back of what you were saying there, and then
Sure.
we can go to someone else as well.
Yeah, no, happy to. Look, I will talk about some of the key profit drivers as it relates to regenerative agriculture. I think the big one, and many have alluded, I think Charlie was alluding to this as well, is you have less overheads and less variable costs, without a doubt. So you've got the less inputs, such as the need for as much drenching. You have less pests and diseases needing to be treated, less feeding of grain, hay or silage, and less vet bills. Now, I have definitely found that in my own operation. I didn't have to feed stock through droughts. I have 0 dark cutters right now, so I'm sort of having a competition with myself on that when it comes, because I actually sell to the MSA grass-fed job, and you don't want dark cutting cattle, and that's really about cattle handling. And in our own operations, we do get price premiums for our livestock. And it's because of this incredible diversity of native and improved high finishing pasture species. And that's honestly obtained through grazing techniques over the last 25 years. So it's a profitable family farm and succession plan is in place. So if you can reduce your overheads and your variable costs, you're definitely on the path, and that is a key driver.
I think it's also, Lorraine, you made a great point there around, the higher margin, higher price for your product at the other end. And I think that's something that the audience would be really interested to hear, to be like, okay, well, we go to a lot of effort in producing this, and what are we going to get at the end? And I think we can tease that out a little bit. And I know, Charlie, you as an example, sort of sell direct to local butchers, I believe, as sort of a product from farm to plate. How have you seen sort of an enhanced price for that product?
Well, there's definitely the opportunity to do that. I mean, the people are asking better questions in the butcher shops and in grocery stores and so on. We're beef and lamb and pork is what we're selling. So when there is a demand that's being created, and that demand is essentially based around the cleanliness of the food, how much chemical was used, if at all, what was the ethical treatment of it and so on. So the good news is that what we're seeing is ideally we would have a demand economy. We would have an economy that's not just supply and demand, right? I mean, we've all been to Economics 101, and that's the way the world works. My view is that the healthy economy is one that is based on demand. And if people aren't growing things, I'm getting a little bit off track, but I hope there's a point to it. If people aren't growing things before they know where they're going to sell it to, or actually even sold it before it's even grown, put in the ground and so on, then they don't. If people, I got lost there. If people haven't already locked a price in or know where it's going to go to, that can be problematic, because they could be creating something and producing something that doesn't have an end market, and then you become a price taker.
Yeah.
What we're finding is that we're becoming price makers, and because there's a demand for our product, and as I said, there's a demand there because it's clean, it's ethically grown, there's a story behind it. We say we've got to sell a sizzle, not just a sausage. I mean, people can go and buy a steak at a butcher shop, not know where it's from. Sure, it might taste good. That's great. That's great. But if there's a story behind it, people are willing to pay that, and that's what we're finding. Now, that's all good. That's all good and well, and it doesn't mean that if you've got a clean product, you can just go to a butcher shop and expect a premium. You have to, earn respect for them. And butchers they're tough businessmen, So if you're selling direct, but if you create trust and you put time into that, and you prove to them that this product that you have and the story attached to it are worth his time in bothering to go direct to you, there's a lot of benefit in that. And so we sell beef into a couple of butcher shops in Sydney, some pork and lamb. A lot of our pork goes locally, and that's great because we're all about, ideally, I'd love everything that we produce to be sold locally, and we support the community and their nutritional requirements right there. So there's less food miles. and we're creating a community of customers. You know, we say we're not certified biodynamic or organic. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be, but we say we're certified by community because we have a relationship with them. And I'm finding that people who are stepping into this space of regenerative ag, they're the kinds of people who want to create a relationship. You know, they're not just content with, I know an agent, I sell it to him, and it's gone, and I don't care. You know, I'm a food producer now. I was a commodity farmer, and I was all about quantity. Now I'm much more about quality, and I consider every day, am I contributing to people's health in a positive way or a negative way? And so
that consumer piece is really powerful in terms of the trends that we're seeing at a macro and a micro level, right? Whether it's in the local community or at a global scale. And Tony, you did mention that earlier around, what role is a consumer playing in all of this? And I guess, having that in mind, what could we, or what would we like to see in the sort of food supply chains to start, I guess, showing some of that quality and that assurance that's coming through to give that consumer confidence?
Yeah, look, John, it's a really interesting and long-winded question and answer, I suppose. I mean, I love what Charlie's saying about, building relationships with local butchers or butchers in Sydney or wherever they might be, and then having that traceability and understanding where and how that product is produced, whether it's beef or whether it's cauliflowers. I think the issue of consumer behaviour, consumer purchasing behaviour, and what they value and what they don't, and whether that means on a Tuesday night when they're rushing home from the work and grabbing something, or is it on a Saturday night when they've got time to plan? I think, in my experience working with consumers and major multinationals, is a really complex and hard to nail down pattern or science. There is often no science to it. It's more of an art around what consumers pick and when they pick and what influences their behaviour. But we definitely, as an industry, should have a system that, and to use Charlie's words, I think he said consumers or community certified. I mean, that's great. I don't think it's going to work for everyone, though. It might work for buyers or suppliers in particular regions, but for the broader community, we're talking sort of mass community here. I think when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we have to work towards some sort of scheme or system or certification that says this is regenerative agriculture, because there's numerous schemes over many decades, whether that's fair trade or Rainforest Alliance or sustainable seafood practices, forestry. There's many schemes out there that are working. They're in the system. But what underpins them? What makes them work against your stock standard cornflakes on the shelf that have been produced by broader agriculture? So I hope that makes some sense. But what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that the certification, the data systems that underpin any scheme are really important, and we've got to have the metrics around consumer support and trust in those systems.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that of how do we connect consumer to producer and what that looks like through the supply chain. And there's many pieces to that, obviously, but currently it's quite fragmented. And so there's a lot of work that needs to happen through that industry. And look, an interesting question that's come through from the audience, from Paul, on that sort of topic, Tony, around how do people get into it and what does that mean? So the question was, what are the funding opportunities to convert your farm to regenerative agriculture? And are you seeing or seeing any of those sort of funding opportunities to drive that?
Look, I think there are, because I think people, governments, organisations, businesses have for a little while now recognised the need to connect with consumers, and we're in the information age. So people need to know, want to know how and where their product is produced. So there are either commercially or from public sector governments more funding opportunities to actually develop systems, sustainable regenerative systems, but to prove them as well. And without sort of jumping on the NFF bandwagon here. I mean, we're looking at a system now to try and or trial a voluntary system to determine, biodiversity on farm. What does that look like? What does a system, what does a market-based system look like? So there is funding there to actually pick up on these ideas, these concepts that monetize that philosophy and commercialize it, but importantly set up a system. So it's not, we build on perhaps what Charlie's doing or what Lorraine's doing around, they've got a system that's recognised by their butcher or their purchaser, but it is broader for the agriculture sector. And I think that there is, whether, NAB with some of their natural capital work, there's a number of banks that are doing, looking into that. So I feel like it's happening on multiple different levels, but it's a long-winded answer to your question. There is funding available from government and from commercial organisations to take steps in this space.
Yeah, and actually I read that NAB were the first bank to offer preferential funding opportunities around kind of regenerative agricultural practices. So it's
them and others. I mean, it's happening. I know Rabo's got some stuff, so it's happening out there.
Yeah, it's great to see that trend, and I guess as we look forward to the future of ultimately passing on the land to future generations. Julie from the audiences has come in and said, how can we actually involve the next generation, our teenagers, the youth, in learning and experiencing regenerative agriculture? Sam, I don't know whether you've got some views of obviously coming into ag, getting back on the farm relatively recently, and in time I'm sure you'll be looking to pass it on to future generations as well.
Yeah, no, look, it's been really exciting to kind of come back in, and I mean, I've been building this business for about 2.5 years, on paper, and based out of Melbourne, working in corporate and ag tech, and have kind of come down here. And it wasn't really until early this year that I actually looked into what regenerative agriculture was. I'm like, oh, that's actually mostly what we're doing. So yeah, it's been a nice community to kind of plug into and grow within. We've actually been contacted, I reckon, by we're building a really big social profile. We're going direct to market. We're already liaising with butchers, retailers and restaurants kind of all over the country. And we have a big social focus. And the reason I mention that is we've already had, I reckon, 5 or 6 young people reach out to us that want to come and work on the farm and learn about what we're doing and understand the processes. And I've been on, commercial farms, on and off in my career, my adult life. And I don't recall having young people reach out and be really, really excited about the future of agriculture, if this is what it's going to look like. There's a lot of things that the conventional ag system turns off the next gen. It's that, a lot of skepticism around chemical use and actual true sustainability practices and where we're headed with this and its real impacts on the environment and carbon, global warming, and the story goes on. But I suppose just to give you some experience, we've had 6 or 7 people reach out. They want to come and work with us and learn about what we're doing, and we're starting to come up with a bit of a system around how we manage and work with those people, which is really cool. So I don't think there's any lack of interest. I think there's some really great traction and momentum out there in the market where we can start to help people understand what it is. But I mean, one thing that's come up throughout this webinar, which is really how do you teach or pass on this information when it is incredibly broad and there is still a lacking of data, right? Because there are some people that just do one component of regenerative agriculture, which is wonderful, but could you call their product truly regenerative if they don't do all these other things? And because there isn't a quantification or protocol around the actual system, all of a sudden it makes it a bit difficult. And then, and then don't even get me started on that kind of consumer supply chain piece. And you and Tony were just talking about that, as it becomes really, really difficult from an integrity point of view. To have, and I'm digressing a bit, but it's going to become increasingly difficult for retailers to stand by a product as regenerative. Well, what does that even mean? So as much as the organic sector, I believe in some ways shot themselves in the foot, they also have a really rigid list of protocols that are audited and you have to adhere to for your product to be deemed organic. Now that, as I said, it's kind of worked well for them. It's probably worked not so well for them. And a lot of the regenerative leaders around the world don't want to see that happen to regenerative agriculture. They don't want it to be quantified. And the beauty of it is that it is flexible and that it is open to interpretation. But from a commercial supply chain point of view, if Coles are going to want to whack that on the front of a thing, they're going to want to have a full kind of process behind it. And sorry, I've digressed, but
look, I think that's absolutely pertinent on the, you know, the balance between making it flexible and also having a system in place that you know, means that someone could stand behind that, a retailer could stand behind that to give that consumer confidence. Lorraine, do you see any of that, I guess, from a, you know, on the ground perspective, where this sort of balance between, okay, well, should we go down the path of saying this is what regenerative agriculture means? You've got to tick these 3 boxes so that can be a start to driving that assurance through the supply chain. And is that something that you kind of work on?
Yeah, this is a really tricky question. And you're correct. Organics have really shot themselves in the foot because it's so prescriptive. You know, you're either in or you're out. There's nothing in between. The whole way regenerative practitioners work is that it's based on collaborative models. It's based on a journey of ever improving practice. And if we pigeonhole what is in and what is out now, we miss opportunities of a higher level understanding about ecology and about how our landscapes work and operate. So it is tricky, but I understand that branding exercise and that consumer confidence plays a really important role. And the holistic management organisations are actually working on accreditation or certification in that space, which is great, and that's certifying a certain practice. But regenerative ag it's going to be ever evolving, and new practices will come about and old ones will fall off. And I don't know if we want to go into what some of those practices actually are, because people might be surprised that in actual fact, they're already doing some of those practices on their farm. And regenerative ag is basically a journey where you just continue to implement more practices after you see the results. You know, you don't do it all at once. That's like a detox. It's a gradual step of continuous improvement. So yeah, the certification sort of argument, it is tricky. We definitely do not want to fall into the same trap that the organics guys have, because it's polarizing. And regenerative agriculture is not about polarizing people. It's about being inclusive.
Carly, I see you raising your hand there. Obviously, you know, throw your hand in the air and you'll get your airtime.
I read that in the fine print when I signed up for this. No, I think it's, I just wanted to say, in terms of sort of a certification or a verification program, I mean, to try and distill that into something that might be reasonably tangible is, as farmers, what are we? We're food producers, right? At the end of the day, that's what we're doing. You know, yes, we are improving habitat and we're improving soil, and there's a lot of stuff around the products that we produce. So if that's our main job, while stewarding the landscape we're using, utilising and responsible for me, there's 2 things that we would measure very objectively in food, and that's its nutrient density, right? That's pretty easy to do. Well, it's getting easier to do even with handheld devices now, that you can literally walk in. If it's not today, it'll be tomorrow. Walk into a supermarket and I've got 2 apples. I can test this one. I can test that one. I can tell within seconds almost. That's a better quality in its sort of a reasonably broad sense of the word better. And also chemical, residual chemical in there as well. I mean, they're 2 very measurable, very simple to understand parameters that we could use. Literally, consumers could walk into a supermarket and do that. That, to me, identify whether this bit of food, whether it's certified or whatever, has been grown, and it's relative, obviously. So this is cleaner than that, and that is more nutritiously dense than that one. And I think that's probably somewhere we should start. And again, and John and Sam, you probably know, and even Tony know more about it. Oh, and Lorraine, everyone but me probably know more about what the technology that's currently been developed to enable people to objectively identify this. And I think it's almost like you don't even need to put a stamp on that bit of food in that thing. You just go in there with your machine and measure it, and then you work out, depending on your parameters and your reference point, whether you want to buy that apple or not. So I think that's a really exciting development.
Tony, what's your views on Charlie's points there around those 2 items that could be measured? a consumer being able to ultimately walk in with a device and pick up their apple. Sorry, I think we might, that the old mute button again.
My mouse was frozen. I was trying to get off mute. So yeah, I mean, I've had a little bit of experience in discussion about this for a while. So the suggestion that you'd go in and pick up your can of tomatoes and scan something on the back of it, and it would say where it's produced and how it was produced and how much water per kilo and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I subscribe to the idea, the concept that people are going to do that. But I think it goes back to the point I was making before around consumer purchasing behaviour. I'd love to think that, we pick up a banana or a kilo of beef or something and have got time to go through and do all of that. Some people might love to do that. I would hypothesize that most of us go in and throw things off the shelf and go in and it might be a time, on a special occasion where we might go into a particular meat provider and say we want a beautiful bit of steak because we're having our family over and that sort of thing. I think that comes down to the consumer behaviour, and that is an art, not a science. But the point around traceability and information of how a product is produced is real. It's just whether the consumer wants to actually rely on that. And I think there's a couple of aspects to that. One is that the regulatory approach. So, there's standards and guidelines and regulations around how we need to do things. So that's the stick, the bottom basement common denominator thing. And then every other system on top of that is possibly less stringent or less reliable, but there's an opportunity for people, for the industry to help drive that. But whether someone would pick up an apple and say, well, which one's the more nutrient, either efficient or valuable, I like the idea. I just don't know whether it's actually going to translate in purchasing behaviour.
Yeah, well, I think that's a big thing in all of this as well. When you look at consumer demands, and we talk about high quality products and organic products, and sometimes if you look at at a global scale, there's still a huge population out there that are ultimately just looking for ground meat in burgers. So we can often get really focused on consumer demands for high quality product, but there's also the other side of the spectrum of the millions of people out there that are looking for bulk product, and it's always that balance between quality and quantity that even Charlie, you mentioned there. So look, what we might do, unless there's anyone else that wants to raise their hand to talk about that particular topic, Lorraine. Yep.
No, I wasn't actually going to talk about that particular topic, but before we get just too far away from the profit drivers, because I'm very focused on this. It's very important in the current environment that we do talk about profit, and I just wanted to go back to that because I mentioned about overheads and variable costs, but there's another element that we really need to be aware of, and that's water retention. So with the impact of climate change and perhaps less rainfall, and there's going to be definitely more of that, conventional farming methods do reduce rain infiltration into the soil and decrease soil nutrients, resulting in lower soil moisture and the need for more fertiliser inputs. So carbon in the soil is significantly then reduced. So bare soil basically encourages the growth of weeds and exacerbates the need for herbicides. High tillage and bare fields exhibit more soil erosion, diminished rainfall, infiltration and water storage ability. Now this is the whole water retention thing is where regenerative agricultural practice really stands alone. And so I don't think we can sort of brush that aside. It is very much a key profit driver to be able to capture that water in the ground. We've all seen those terrific video footages of topsoil running off into the neighbours' rivers, or the big windstorms where it's ended up all of our topsoil's gone in New Zealand. So I think that's a very critical point, and it is what drives profit. You need to capture moisture in the ground. And basically what the researchers found, there's been some very strong research done by Dr. Richard Teague in Texas University around this. And, basically he's saying that regenerative ag does result in much lower inputs, so your profit margins increase. And the practices absolutely set you up to be more resilient in the future. And I think there's also a lot of research, getting back to the consumer, even our own Professor Carlo Lafert from the Organics Research Centre, you know, he's done extraordinary worldwide research in the benefits, the connections really, it's from soil health to plant health, to animal health and human health. And that is peer-reviewed, solid research on the way that we produce food is affecting human health and our ability to be resilient, our stomach biome to be able to fight major diseases like what we're seeing. And so there's some pretty solid research now around the world in that space. It's only a matter of time before consumers are aware of these sort of solid research messages that are coming out. And so having the tools to be able to measure how food is produced, where it was produced, who produced it, and was it done in a humane manner will be critical into the future. So yes, the consumer is a profit driver. Retaining water is a profit driver. Reducing overheads and variable costs is a profit driver. And I have to say the research is solid that the regenerative ag practices are stacking up at all of those levels.
Well, thanks for that, Lorraine. And actually, it's quite fitting. You know, we're sort of might even dig into some of the questions that are coming through from the audience. And really, you know, there's a lot of questions around, you know, what are the actual practices of regenerative agriculture? You know, we've spoken a lot about, you know, the benefits and the supply chain and those types of things, but I think the audience is really keen to hear, you know, what are the actual practices? What are you doing on the ground? What can you do? And particularly, there's a question that's come in from, you know, from Justine that said, well, what can be incorporated, you know, in drought periods with, you know, someone's said in excess of 4 years. You know, our family businesses also have been in drought for about 4 or 5 years. And what we have done over the past is really around diverting flood off and water to prevent erosion, but also really so that water would run out onto those plains. It would then regenerate and get regrowth as opposed to just being washed down the creek. So that's something that we have spent a lot of time and money and investment over the years in the flow of water and regenerating regrowth through that methods. But I think it'd be great to get back to, you know, what's actually happening on the ground and you know, probably love to hear from Lane, Charlie and Sam on this of what those actual practices are.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick that one off and understand the practices, like I've mentioned before, they're not set in concrete. We would hope to think that our level of knowledge, research, education and understanding in this space is on a continual spiral upwards, not downwards. And the critical thing is that we do need to not be looking at some of these horrific challenges that we're facing in these really complex systems in a reductionist manner. We need to look at things in a holistic manner. So just for everybody's benefit, these are some of the current practices that constitute regenerative agriculture. And whenever I list these practices, people go, oh my God, I'm actually doing some of those things already. Maybe I am a regenerative farmer. So it's really important to be clear about what does constitute regenerative agriculture at this point in time. So we have things like applying organic composts, fertilizers and bioamendments, encouraging natural biological cycles and nutrient transfer, reducing or ceasing synthetic chemical inputs. So it doesn't, unlike organics, it doesn't mean you can't use chemical inputs. The key word is reducing and really questioning whether you need to be putting in so many chemicals into the soil. Implementing time-controlled planned grazing, using grazing management and animal impact as a farm and ecosystem development tool, self-herding and stress-free stockmanship, constructing interventions in the landscape or in the waterways, such as leaky weirs, to slow the flow of water. Again, this is about water retention in a drier period going forward. Fencing off waterways and implementing water reticulation for stock, rehydrating wetlands, investing in revegetation, multi-species pasture cropping. Southern Cross University is doing a lot of research in the multi-species pasture cropping and its ability to sequester carbon at a very fast pace. Pasture sowing, changing crop rotations, incorporating green manure or undersowing of legumes, retaining stubble or performing biological stubble breakdown, no keel and cover cropping, managing for increasing species diversity, integrating enterprises, and basically feral animal and noxious weed control. So we all do those things.
So
all of them, but
there's a lot in there. It's obviously very, very holistic. We've discussed a lot about that. There's a lot of questions coming in on this, and Camilla had one in here as well, which is, okay, how do we get started? What do we actually do to get started? There's a lot there, and maybe Sam and Charlie could comment on that. And Sam, look, obviously, you've come back to the farm recently. It'd be great to get some insights on that. And then Charlie, obviously, your business, family business, 8th generation, was very commodity based, high input, and then you've made that shift. I think just giving some on the ground perspective of what steps you can take, and obviously you don't need to take them all initially, but how do you look about making that change?
Yeah, cool. Thanks, mate. So so took on this farm about 12 months ago, and I think a big thing about it is it's all about kind of and it's already been mentioned, lessening those inputs and finding your fit in the way you want to kind of go with it. So the three things that we really focus on is rotational or time control grazing. I've kind of grown up in that system. The old man did his RCS course in 1985, and so I've kind of converted a number of different farms over the years. So that's a big part, is our grazing piece. And I really want to mention the time control bit, or cell grazing. Rotational is great, but time controlled and cells are even better. The next piece is multi-species, so diversity of forage. We are running a carbon project, quite a big one, which is kind of cool. And I suppose just on that point, it's really around mimicking Mother Nature. So if you go into any bush or any jungle or natural environment in the world, you will not see Mother Nature growing one or two varieties. Generally, you'll see lots of different things happening. And basically, by putting a multi-species in, where you're putting a mix of legumes, brassicas, cereals, and grasses in, you're going to get that kind of, we call it a salad bowl effect. Cattle love it, and we don't find we get many weeds in those paddocks because you've already got tap roots. You've already got all the things that Mother Nature's trying to do, but you're just putting it in front of her in a way that cattle will consume. So rotational time control grazing, multi-species, and then the last piece is not using conventional inputs like NPK, and stuff like that. Insecticides, fungicides, huge no-no. And I think, it's already been mentioned, this farm used to get about 300 units of N every autumn and every spring. So I would liken it in a way to a bit of a drug addict. And we've got to wean it off. I'm a bit of a go hard or go home person. I'm not here to muck around. So I've just pulled the rug out from underneath it and gone straight into full regen ag. And we haven't dropped productivity much, but it's going to be 2 or 3 years, I think, before our farm really starts to stand on its own 2 feet and we can restore those biological processes enough, to Charlie's point, where we can either produce most of what it is that we need to grow what we do. We're running about 28 DSC per hectare down here, so it's a pretty fast moving ship. So they're the three kind of things that we're doing. And as far as, just quickly what to start with, whatever it is that takes your fancy and changing your mindset and starting to work on that and implement it. If you're running a 3 or 4, 5,000 acre property, you don't have to do the whole farm. Just do those 2 or 3 paddocks. Just trial it for a couple of years, see how it responds, go easy, de-risk, just do whatever you feel comfortable. Then of course you'll start to notice that Mother Nature and the environment and the farm starting to behave in a different way, and your powers of observation, I should hope, will increase throughout this process, and then at that time you might start to kind of want to integrate it across the whole place or change stuff up.
There's some great insights there, Sam. Either the cold turkey or the Nicorette patch. It's both can work. Charlie, what's your quick views on this before there's some highly voted questions I'd love to rip through.
A couple of things there. One, I say, you've really got to consider changing the paddock between your ears first, because I went cold turkey, a bit like Sam probably. I went out hard, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I was changing my mindset in between my ears as I changed my paddocks, and that's fine. but expect to have some, hit some walls and learn some hard lessons. I also suggest two other things. One is that one thing to consider between your ears is consider that nature is your most valuable business partner, right? It is the most uncontrollable, uncertain, powerful, ever-present business partner in your business and your life and in your world. So if you don't want to treat any business partner badly, and there's many ways we have and can treat nature very badly. So if we consider it as a business partner and working with it is the most productive use of our time and our resources, and not consider it a resource, again, consider it a business partner. Because if you're in a sort of a depletive taking mentality, this is a two-way street, and it's about giving back. As farmers, we're producing something, we're making something, we're going forward. If we consider that nature is going to be there for a very long time, many generations down the track, we've got to create a relationship with it. The other thing I do, a bit relating to what Sam said there before about budgeting. If you've got a budget for dollars you spend to produce a crop, or your grazing, or your pasture establishment, whatever, it's pick a number, $100 an acre. Carve off 10% and use a biological additive or something else. As Sam was saying, step into it lightly if that's the way you want to do it, and get a result and grow your confidence in this. And the other thing I'd say just quickly, Sam, John, is find a mentor. Find someone who's done it, someone who's nearby, does it the other side of the world. David Marsh is one of my great mentors, and I've just done a podcast with him on my new podcast series, John. I'll just give a quick plug. But my point is, he's a lovely, finding someone who's made those mistakes and sharing your wins, sharing your losses, and it's okay to stuff things up because we're only human.
Yeah, thank you for that, Charlie. And Lorraine, I see you putting your hand up there. So if we could just a quick one before I want to move on to some of these questions here.
Sure. I just want to, just following on from what Charlie just said, we need to be very aware of the language and the narrative that's starting to actually polarize people, I think, around the nation. And particularly the inquiry that came out from the fires, I started to hear, and this was from the previous fire commissioner, it's the war against climate change, the war against the fires, bring in the military, let's combat the enemy. That's effectively saying the enemy is Mother Nature. So we're now at war with the environment. You know what? We're not going to win that war. We need to work with the environment. We need to work with Mother Nature. As Charlie said, partner, not be at war and combat this so-called enemy called Mother Nature and our environment. Because this is a war we will not win. And if we think we would win that war, we're absolute fools. But just start to listen to some of the language, and it's the language of our politicians. So I've heard Barilaro say the war against climate change. It's probably as ridiculous as when we were saying the war against ice, or is it a war against COVID? Good luck.
Very
how that pans out. So.
Yeah, very passionate comment there, Lorraine. Thank you for that. And Tony, if I could just, there's the top-rated question at the moment is that it appears to be absence of Indigenous voices and acknowledgement of traditional agricultural practices in the regenerative ag discussion. Be great to get your views on that point there. Obviously, the panels, the audience are really keen to hear some discussion on that.
Well, I think Lorraine touched on it. I mean, I think it's working with nature, with the landscape, with the environment, which I've said it a couple of times in various forums. I mean, the first farmers were Indigenous Australians. So, the land management practices, the techniques, the systems, sure, they've changed in thousands of years and in the last couple of 100 years. But there's a lot to learn, I would say, from practices from from what I've called, Australia's first farmers. So we have to have a broad mind and open and be willing to learn around those land management practices. I don't think we do it enough as a community or as a sector. So we definitely have to do that. How do we do that? I haven't got any great answers or silver bullets, but we should definitely do it. If that answers the question, John.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that, Tony. Another one that Jim sent through here, Charlie talked a lot about improving the soil and water mineral cycles while enhancing the soil biological activity and increasing soil carbon. How have these outcomes been defined, and is there hard evidence, peer-reviewed research, that these outcomes have been achieved through regen ag practices? I see a few nods there from Lorraine as well. So
finally I get to talk about research. Thanks, John. Yeah, look, there is some very solid research that has been done and is continuing to be done. So in Australia, in our own country, Dr. Kathy Waters, who's with DPI, is doing extraordinary work in ecosystem services, cost-benefit analysis. It's not very far off before farmers will be able to, through good environmental management, actually see the environment on their balance sheet. Already, banks do not want to be lending money to farms that may make a very good profit one year, but after 2 or 3 years of drought, they're going to fall over. So the financial system is going to want to know that those farms are going to stack up in drier times and in periods of climate change. The insurance companies won't insure them if they can't see that the environmental assets are in order. So this is becoming a very important part of the research agenda. And I believe Kathy Waters is really leading in that space. I mentioned, some of my research in comparing regenerative systems with conventional systems from a triple bottom line. Sue Ogilvie, based out of ANU, has done similar work. We're both coming up with, particularly in the social side of things, some very similar results on the effect of people that are in those systems. Richard Teague of Texas has done huge numbers on the benefits of time-controlled grazing over there and how that has affected the bottom line. And like I said, there's a lot of work now starting to emerge in the health side of things. At Southern Cross, we are, like I said, looking at multi-species pasture cropping, cover cropping, grazing systems, the role of mycorrhizal fungi, and how we can actually inoculate our seeds and really get the whole system in the soil booming. So there is work being done. Be patient. Research takes time, but it is coming. And I guess just watch that space.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Lorraine. And look, we're coming up on time. And so before I, thank everyone for joining, maybe if each of the panelists could give some parting words of wisdom, a final closing point of advice for everyone that's listened in, would be really, really great.
Who do you want to start with?
You can start, Lorraine.
Okay. Look, yeah, my piece of advice is, and it has been mentioned, don't go for the full detox. Just pick up 1 or 2 practices and give it a go. It's a continual journey, and once you're on it, you won't look back. And your resilience into the future, and this is a really important word for us to keep in mind. It's not about the big making money one year and not making money the next. It's about being resilient in our landscapes, in our communities, and with our farms into the future, and financially resilient as well, so that future generations actually can farm. So yeah, just a step at a time, just take that first step. And understand that I honestly believe in the future, we will be carbon farmers. And some of our industries, such as cattle grazing, will be the tool that we use to be carbon farmers. So when someone says, what do you do? I already say I'm a carbon farmer. On my own farm, I've gone down that path and will be carbon trading in the future. And there's a massive educational piece for farmers to learn about carbon farming and carbon trading. There is some huge rewards down the track. And I would imagine even in my own operation that our cattle fattening enterprise will be secondary to our carbon farming enterprise. So I think that's where the future's at, and really just take that first step and implement one of those practices or two of those practices and see how you go.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Lorraine. And actually, I'm glad you brought the carbon piece up. It's one that we didn't spend much time talking about today. We're actually going to run another session, on specifically on the carbon piece, which is obviously a big part of regenerative agriculture. There's been so much interest, obviously, in the lead up to this, and the questions that have come through that we're going to be scheduling another session on this. And I think a big flavour of that is going to be around carbon. Charlie, parting words of wisdom?
Just to say that I can't remember where I picked this up from, but success is the confluence of preparation and opportunity. And I think there's a massive opportunity for farmers to adopt regenerative ag in terms of the food that you can produce, the benefits to their economy, their on-farm economy, their well-being, and to the environment on farm and that general community. So there's a great, we are heading in one direction. We're not going backwards in this sort of a movement, and that's supported in, from all the way from the producers all the way to consumers. And so everyone has an opportunity to get prepared for the opportunity, and being prepared is going to webinars like this, adopting the sort of technology that supports this, asking better questions, finding yourself a mentor, and changing the paddock between your ears. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, I love that quote there. I think hopefully I see that come through on some of the Twitter posts. Sam, from you, mate, parting words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, for me, mindset probably is the biggest thing. Charlie calls it, the paddock between your ears. So that is by far the biggest tipping point. But just a bit of a practical one for the farmers out there, and something that was really instrumental in helping me shift the way I looked at my farm as Charlie says, as a business partner, being a natural ecosystem, or I just kind of, Mother Nature is a parting word of wisdom is, what weeds have you got and why it is that they're growing there? Once I started to read my weeds and understand what specific species grow where and why, and then I bought, and I have no shares in this business or this book, I bought a book called Why Weeds Talk. And to understand why it is those weeds grow, all of a sudden you start to unlock all these aha moments about your soil condition. It's bacterially dominant, you've got compaction, you need tap roots. Weeds are Mother Nature's way of telling you that something's not right here and she's trying to correct it. So get out of her way, stop killing stuff and start putting stuff in front of her that she's going to get behind, and she can start working with you. So that's my little bit of advice.
Sam, love that, and some great practical tips that people can pick up literally tomorrow and roll up the sleeves and get into it. Tony, some final words from you?
Yeah, look, thanks, John. I love the paddock between your ears. Sam's read the weeds and stop killing stuff. They're kind of a couple of takeaways for me. My parting words of wisdom would be that we keep talking about this. I think there's a huge opportunity to pick up on Charlie's point there around understanding, recognizing that when we say regenerative agriculture, a lot of people in the agricultural business, in farming, probably doing a whole lot of that existing activities. And I heard Lorraine say a couple of times, it is not one particular 10 things that you've got to tick. There's practices and procedures and systems in place that probably subscribe or align with, the theory of regenerative agriculture. Let's bring everyone along for that discussion, and let's try not to have division around what is or isn't regenerative agriculture. That would be my sort of wish, that we keep talking about this and we keep, having the discussion so that we can continue to build a sustainable industry and we get to that $100 billion target by 2030.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And thank you for that, Tony. And look, thank you to all our panelists, Charlie, Lorraine, Sam, and Tony. Thank you for your time. I think it's been an absolutely great session. Some of the comments that are coming through have been really loved the session. A lot of appetite. We are going to run another one, as I mentioned. We'll also be writing and publishing a blog that's going to have a lot of these insights that we covered today and more. So keep a lookout for that. And you will receive the recorded version of this and, of course, a survey to see how we can always improve. But thank you for the panelists. Thank you for all those that attended. I've been keeping an eye on it, and it's been, you know, over the 400 mark for the good hour and a half, which I think is a testament to, you know, how people are interested in the direction and the future of farming. So that's all from here, Team AgriWebb. Thanks again for joining, and have a great afternoon. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John.
Thank you.